Germans never knew the U.S. used proximity fuses that obliterated their artillery in seconds. December 16, 1944. Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium, 05:30 hours. The first shell detonated 30 feet above the frozen forest floor, and the sound it made was unlike anything Oberleutnant Hans Weber had heard in 3 years of artillery combat on the Eastern Front. Not the familiar crump of impact explosion, not the whistle shriek of incoming rounds, but something else, a sharp, flat crack that seemed to come from everywhere at once, followed immediately by the metallic rain of thousands of steel fragments slicing through pine branches, through canvas shelters, through the exposed flesh of German artillerymen who had been preparing their 150 mm howitzers for the next phase of the Ardennes offensive. Weber had perhaps 2 seconds to comprehend that the shell had exploded in mid-air before the next salvo arrived. 5 shells, 10 shells, 20 shells, each bursting at precisely calculated heights above the battery position, each fragmenting into optimal patterns that turned the clearing where his guns sat into a killing zone of such geometric efficiency that it seemed designed by a malevolent God with perfect knowledge of ballistics and human vulnerability. The sound that defined those seconds was not the explosions themselves, but the aftermath, a strange, almost musical tinkling as thousands of hot steel fragments fell through frozen tree limbs, striking metal equipment, embedding in frozen earth, and occasionally hitting something softer with a wet thud that needed no translation. Weber, pressed flat against the ground behind a disabled gun carriage, heard this metallic rainfall all around him and understood with the clarity that comes from proximity to death that something fundamental had changed in the nature of artillery warfare. The American counter-battery fire was not just accurate. Accuracy he could respect, could understand as the product of good observation and skilled gunnery. This was something different. These shells were exploding at optimal heights without visible observation, without trial shots to bracket the target, without the normal indicators that would suggest human calculation of fusing. It was as if the shells themselves knew where to detonate for maximum effect, as if they possessed some form of mechanical intelligence that German artillery doctrine had no framework to comprehend. In the shock silence that followed the bombardment, that momentary pause between salvos when the survivors took stock of damage, Weber could hear the moans of wounded men, the crackling of fires where ammunition had been ignited, and beneath it all, a high-pitched ringing in his ears that would persist for days. But what he could not hear, what none of the German forces engaging American artillery that December would ever hear, was the radio frequency signal that each shell emitted as it approached its target, the electromagnetic pulse that reflected off the ground and returned to a receiver in the shell's nose, triggering detonation at the precise altitude where fragmentation would be most lethal. This invisible technology, the variable time fuse, known to its developers as the VT or proximity fuse, represented one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets and one of its most decisive technological advantages. The Germans never knew these fuses existed, never understood why American artillery could devastate their positions with first salvo effectiveness, never comprehended that their enemy possessed an innovation as revolutionary as radar or the atomic bomb, but manifested in a device small enough to fit in an artillery shell's nose. The technological and strategic significance of this moment extended far beyond a single battery position in the Ardennes. The proximity fuse represented the convergence of multiple strands of American institutional and industrial capability, advanced electronics miniaturization, systematic scientific research, industrial mass production of complex devices, and operational security so effective that the technology remained unknown to enemies, despite being fired in hundreds of thousands of rounds. More fundamentally, the fuse exemplified a particular approach to warfare that characterized American military operations: the application of overwhelming technological and material advantages to solve tactical problems, the willingness to invest enormous resources in weapons that would be consumed in single use, and the systematic integration of scientific innovation into operational doctrine at scales that changed strategic balances. To understand why the proximity fuse was so significant and why its existence remained unknown to German forces, one must first comprehend the fundamental problem it solved and the technical challenges its development overcame. Artillery had been central to warfare since the gunpowder revolution, but its effectiveness against different target types varied enormously depending on fuse technology. Against static targets like fortifications, buildings, or massed troops in trenches, impact fuse shells that detonated on contact with the ground were reasonably effective. But against mobile targets, dispersed infantry, or aircraft, impact fuses were far less lethal because the ground absorbed much of the explosion's energy and fragments traveled, primarily laterally, rather than in the all direction, patterns that maximize casualties against dispersed targets. Time. Fuzes, mechanical devices that detonated shells after a set interval, allowed artillery to create airbursts that fragmented above targets, distributing shrapnel more effectively. But time fuses required accurate range estimation, careful calculation of flight time, and mechanical setting of each fuse before firing. Even with skilled crews, time fuses were unreliable. Variations in propellant temperature, barrel wear, atmospheric conditions, and mechanical tolerances meant that shells often burst too high or too low, reducing effectiveness. Against moving targets or in rapidly developing tactical situations, time fuses were nearly useless because the calculations they required took time that tactical circumstances often did not permit. The ideal solution would be a fuse that automatically detected its proximity to the target and detonated at optimal range without requiring human calculation or mechanical presetting. The concept was simple. The implementation was extraordinarily challenging. The fuse would need to emit some form of signal, detect that signal's reflection from nearby objects, determine when the range was optimal for detonation, and trigger the explosive, all while surviving the enormous acceleration of artillery firing, up to 20,000 times the force of gravity, while functioning reliably in extreme cold or heat, and while being cheap enough to produce in the millions because each fuse would be destroyed in the explosion it triggered. Most daunting, all of this needed to be accomplished in a package small enough to fit in an artillery shell's nose and simple enough that industrial production could manufacture it at scales that made the technology operationally decisive rather than merely experimental. American development of the proximity fuse began in 1940, driven by urgent British requests for better anti-aircraft defenses against German bomber attacks. The initial concept focused on anti-aircraft applications, where proximity fusing would eliminate the need for time fusing accuracy. A proximity-fused anti-aircraft shell would automatically detonate near enemy aircraft, dramatically increasing the probability of inflicting damage. The National Defense Research Committee, established in 1940 to coordinate American scientific contributions to defense, assigned the problem to Section T, a research group that would eventually involve hundreds of scientists and engineers from universities, industrial laboratories, and government research facilities. The technical challenges were formidable. The fuse required a radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit in a shell nose, rugged enough to survive firing shock, and reliable enough to function after experiencing accelerations that would destroy conventional electronics. It needed a power source that could activate instantly when fired and provide sufficient energy for the few seconds the shell was in flight. It required a signal processing system that could distinguish ground returns from target returns and trigger detonation at optimal range. All components needed to be manufacturable using production techniques that could scale to millions of units, because experimental technologies that could not be mass-produced were militarily irrelevant. Regardless of their laboratory effectiveness, American researchers solved these problems through a combination of innovation, systematic testing, and industrial engineering. The transmitter and receiver used miniature vacuum tubes specially designed to survive firing shock. Rugged construction, special mounting techniques, and careful testing ensured reliability. The power source was a battery activated by the firing setback force, using the acceleration itself to close a switch that initiated operation. The signal processing used analog circuits that compared transmitted and reflected signals, triggering detonation when the reflection indicated the shell was approximately 70 feet from a large reflecting surface. The entire package was manufactured using techniques adapted from radio and electronics production, with careful quality control, ensuring that the vast majority of fuses functioned as designed, despite the extreme conditions they experienced. By 1942, the proximity fuse had been developed to the point where field testing could begin, and by 1943 it was entering production at scales that were staggering. Millions of fuses per month, manufactured by companies including RCA, Sylvania and Eastman Kodak, using production lines that treated complex electronic assemblies as mass production items, comparable to automobiles or machine tools. The industrial achievement this represented was as significant as the technical innovation. American industry could manufacture sophisticated electronic devices in quantities sufficient to treat them as consumable ammunition, rather than precision instruments, could maintain quality control across multiple manufacturers and production sites, and could sustain this production while simultaneously manufacturing radar systems, communications equipment, fire control computers, and all the other electronic systems modern warfare demanded. The proximity fuse entered combat in the Pacific Theater in early 1943, used initially in anti-aircraft roles where its effectiveness was immediately apparent. American ships equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition shot down Japanese aircraft at rates that far exceeded conventional time-fused ammunition. But the fuse's existence remained highly classified, with strict controls on its use to prevent examples from falling into enemy hands where they might be reverse-engineered. The fuses were authorized for use only over water in the Pacific, where unfired shells or duds would sink rather than being recoverable by the enemy, and their use was forbidden in Europe until operational circumstances guaranteed that the technology would not be compromised. The decision to employ proximity fuses in Europe came in December 1944, as German forces launched their surprise Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. American commanders, facing a serious tactical crisis as German armored and infantry forces penetrated Allied lines, determined that the advantages of proximity-fused artillery outweighed the security risks. The fuses were authorized for use in anti-personnel roles, where shells bursting above German formations would maximize casualties and suppress the offensive's momentum. This decision transformed the ground war in ways that tactical doctrine had not fully anticipated, and that German forces had no framework to comprehend. Oberleutnant Weber, in the moments after that first devastating airburst bombardment, attempted to assess the damage and understand what had happened. His battery had lost 3 of 6 guns in the first minute of fire, not destroyed entirely but damaged sufficiently that they could not be fired without repair. More significantly, his battery had lost nearly half its personnel, killed, wounded, or too stunned to function effectively. The survivors were demoralized in ways that conventional artillery fire had never achieved, unnerved by the uncanny precision of airbursts that seemed to know exactly where German positions were and exactly what altitude would maximize the killing. Radius Weber's training and experience provided no explanation. American artillery was known to be accurate, but this accuracy seemed to transcend normal fire control capabilities. The shells had not bracketed the position with ranging shots, had not required multiple salvos to adjust fire. The first salvo had been devastatingly on target, with every shell bursting at optimal height. Weber initially suspected American forward observers with exceptional visibility, but the morning fog and forest cover made that unlikely. Some instinct, some veteran soldier's sense that something was categorically wrong, told him this was not simply good gunnery, but something fundamentally different in nature. Over the following days and weeks, as the Ardennes offensive ground to a halt under combined pressure from American reinforcements, air power, and artillery, German soldiers across the front experienced similar encounters with proximity-fused artillery. Formations caught in the open were devastated by airbursts that caught them in kill zones, where fragments arrived from above, defeating the cover that terrain normally provided. German infantry learned to fear American artillery in new ways, recognizing that the normal tactical responses, taking cover, dispersing, using terrain features, provided less protection than doctrine suggested because the shells detonated above rather than at ground level. The psychological impact accumulated as German soldiers realized they were facing a threat they could not effectively counter, could not understand, and could not escape. The sound of proximity fuse detonations, that distinctive flat crack of airbursts, became associated in German consciousness with American firepower and technological superiority. It was a sound without precedent, different from the explosions they had experienced on the Eastern Front or in North Africa, carrying implications they could sense even if they could not articulate. Each crack announced the presence of an enemy whose technological capabilities exceeded German understanding. whose industrial resources could produce complex devices in quantities that made them as common as conventional ammunition, whose systematic approach to warfare emphasized overwhelming material advantage over tactical finesse. German intelligence attempted to understand what was happening. Reports from survivors mentioned shells exploding at consistent heights above ground, devastation patterns that suggested optimized fragmentation geometry, and the disturbing absence of the ranging fire that normally preceded accurate artillery barrages. Some intelligence officers speculated about new fuse technologies, possibly radio-based proximity detection, but these remained speculations without hard evidence. No intact proximity fuse fell into German hands during the battle. The fuses either functioned as designed, destroying themselves in the explosion, or in the rare cases of malfunction, buried themselves in frozen earth where recovery was unlikely amid active combat operations. This intelligence failure was not accidental, but the result of deliberate American operational security. Instructions for proximity fuse use included strict protocols to minimize the chance of enemy recovery. Fuses were not to be used in attacks on fixed positions where dud rounds might be recoverable, were to be used primarily in fluid combat situations, where German forces lacked time and resources for systematic battlefield exploitation, and were subject to restrictions that balanced operational effectiveness against security risks. The security protocols succeeded. The Germans never obtained a functioning proximity fuse for technical analysis, never reverse-engineered the technology, and never developed effective countermeasures. Beyond the obvious tactical adaptation of seeking cover that overhead bursts made less effective, the strategic impact of proximity fuses extended beyond their direct tactical effects. American artillery, already superior to German artillery in quantity and mobility by late 1944, gained a qualitative advantage that further tilted the balance. American artillery could engage German positions with first-round effectiveness, could neutralize German artillery through devastating counter-battery fire, and could provide close support to advancing infantry, with confidence that air bursts would clear defensive positions more effectively than ground bursts. The cumulative effect was artillery dominance that German forces could not contest, creating local air superiority of a sort, air superiority not through aircraft but through shells that burst, above like mechanical thunderclouds raining steel, fragments with geometric precision. The economic and industrial dimensions of proximity fuse deployment were as significant as the tactical effects. Each proximity fuse cost approximately $20 to produce, roughly 20 times the cost of a conventional mechanical fuse. This price differential would have made proximity fuses prohibitively expensive for most militaries, but American industrial capacity and economic resources made it feasible to produce and employ millions of proximity fuses as consumable ammunition. By war's end, over 22 million proximity fuses had been manufactured, with approximately half used in combat. This represented an investment of hundreds of millions of dollars in devices that would be destroyed in the instant they achieved their purpose, consumed in quantities that seemed almost reckless, but that reflected fundamental American advantages in industrial production and economic resources. Weber survived the Ardennes campaign, surrendered to American forces in March 1945, and spent time in prisoner-of-war camps where he encountered other German artillery officers who shared similar stories of devastation from American airbursts. In conversations that mixed professional curiosity with the bitter acknowledgement of defeat, these men compared experiences and attempted to understand what technology had produced such effects. Their speculations ranged from plausible, radio-based proximity detection, to fantastic, infrared heat sensors, acoustic triggers, but none had definitive information, and all were united in recognition that American artillery had possessed capabilities German forces could not match. It was not until after the war, during post-surrender technical intelligence sharing, that German scientists and military officers learned about proximity fuses. The revelation came through technical publications and intelligence reports declassified after the war's conclusion, and the reaction among German technical personnel was a mixture of professional admiration for the engineering achievement and frustration that such technology had existed without their knowledge. Dr. Friedrich Hartmann, the same engineer who had analyzed P-51 drop tanks in 1943, later wrote in his memoirs about learning of proximity fuses. We had suspected something of this nature, but the reality exceeded our speculations. The Americans had solved problems we had only begun to formulate, had manufactured solutions in quantities we could never have sustained, and had employed them with operational security that prevented us from understanding what we faced. It was a comprehensive defeat, technical, industrial, and doctrinal. The proximity fuse's broader significance lay in what it revealed about American institutional capabilities and how different nations approached the relationship between science, industry, and warfare. The fuse required close coordination between academic researchers, industrial engineers, military planners, and production managers, coordination that American institutions achieved through systematic organization and shared goals. The National Defense Research Committee, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and the military services created structures that facilitated this coordination, that translated laboratory innovations into producible designs, and that integrated new weapons into operational doctrine systematically rather than experimentally. German institutions, by contrast, struggled with coordination despite possessing excellent scientists and engineers. The Nazi regime's institutional fragmentation, competing power centers, personal rivalries between leaders, Hitler's interventions in technical decisions, impeded the kind of systematic innovation to production pipeline that American institutions achieved. German researchers developed advanced technologies, but translating those technologies into operational weapons at scales that mattered strategically was consistently problematic. The proximity fuse exemplified what happened when functional institutions with adequate resources confronted dysfunctional institutions with inadequate resources. The functional side produced decisive advantages, while the dysfunctional side produced explanations for why things were impossible. The sound of proximity fuse detonations, those flat cracks that announced airbursts above German positions, became, in the post-war period, a symbol of American technological warfare and industrial capacity. It represented more than just effective munitions. It represented an approach to warfare that emphasized systematic technological advantage, that invested enormous resources in weapons that would be consumed in single use, and that treated complex electronic devices as producible in quantities sufficient to change strategic balances. The sound was evidence of industrial civilization operating at frontiers of what was technically achievable while maintaining production, scales that ensured experimental technologies became operationally decisive, rather than merely interesting for soldiers who survived proximity-fused artillery bombardments. The memory of those sounds remained traumatic. Hans Weber, in his post-war life as a civil engineer rebuilding German infrastructure, occasionally encountered sounds that triggered memories. The crack of lightning during summer storms, the report of industrial equipment failing, any sharp metallic sound that approximated the distinctive airburst crack. Each time the memory returned, lying frozen against cold Belgian earth, hearing steel fragments rain through tree branches, feeling the helplessness of facing a threat that doctrine provided no defense against and that exceeded tactical understanding. The sound became associated not just with artillery, but with a broader recognition of defeat, with the understanding that Germany had challenged opponents whose advantages were so comprehensive that courage and tactical skill could not overcome material and technological disparities. The strategic lessons from proximity fuses influenced post-war military development across multiple nations. The fuse demonstrated that electronics could be miniaturized and ruggedized to survive extreme conditions, that complex devices could be mass-produced at scales that made them consumable ammunition, and that systematic research coordination could produce weapons that changed tactical and operational balances. Post-war military establishments, particularly in the United States and Soviet Union, invested heavily in guided munitions, smart weapons, and precision strike capabilities that descended intellectually from the proximity fuse's example. Using electronics and sensors to make individual weapons more effective, accepting higher per-unit costs in exchange for increased per-shot lethality, and maintaining the industrial base necessary to produce sophisticated weapons in quantities sufficient for sustained operations. The proximity fuse also influenced broader discussions about technology and warfare, about how innovations changed tactical and strategic calculations, and about the relationship between military requirements and civilian research institutions. The fuse demonstrated that World War II was not just a conflict of armies and industries, but also a competition between different approaches to organizing scientific research, to translating innovations into operational capabilities, and to sustaining complex production while maintaining quality control. The side that could coordinate research, development, production, and deployment most effectively gained advantages that could be as decisive as numerical superiority or tactical brilliance. In the frozen forests of Belgium in December 1944, in artillery positions across Western Europe through the war's final months, German soldiers heard the crack of proximity fuse detonations and felt the fragments raining from optimized airbursts without understanding the technology that produced such effects. They experienced the results of American innovation and industrial capacity, made manifest in devices small enough to fit in shell noses, yet sophisticated enough to revolutionize artillery effectiveness. They learned through brutal experience that their enemy possessed technological advantages they had not anticipated, industrial capabilities they could not match, and institutional competencies that enabled systematic translation of scientific knowledge into operational dominance. The sound of those airbursts, the flat crack that announced detonation at optimal height, carried across battlefields as acoustic evidence of asymmetric technological warfare, as the audio signature of American industrial civilization, applying its advantages to military problems with devastating effectiveness. That sound announced to anyone listening that the war would be decided not by tactical skill or operational artistry, but by overwhelming material and technological superiority. That Germany faced an opponent whose institutional and industrial capabilities exceeded German capacities in ways that made defeat inevitable, regardless of how well individual German units fought. The crack of proximity fuse detonations was the sound of modernity arriving in warfare, the announcement that future conflicts would be won by nations capable of systematic innovation at industrial scales, and the requiem for military organizations that relied on tactical excellence without possessing the industrial and institutional foundations necessary to compete against enemies who combined tactical competence with comprehensive material advantages. The metallic rain of fragments falling through frozen forests, the distinctive sound of airbursts above helpless targets, the devastation of positions caught in kill zones created by invisible technology. These became the enduring memories of soldiers who survived. Proximity-fused artillery and the historical legacy of a weapon that epitomized how World War II was won. The Germans never knew, at least not until defeat, that the United States used proximity fuses, never understood why American artillery achieved such devastating effectiveness, never comprehended the institutional and industrial capabilities that created and sustained production of millions of complex electronic devices consumed as expendable ammunition. And in that ignorance lay a broader lesson about warfare in the industrial age. That understanding one's enemy required understanding not just their visible capabilities, but the institutional and industrial infrastructure that created those capabilities. That technological surprise could be as decisive as numerical superiority or tactical brilliance, and that the side which could systematically coordinate research, production, and deployment at scales that changed strategic balances possessed advantages that courage and skill alone could never overcome.